Welcome back to the channel, where ordinary history turns into something far more intimate once we look beyond the monuments and the portraits. Tonight, I want to take you into a story that feels less like memorizing names and dates, and more like stepping through a hidden door into another century. We are going to meet George Washington, not as the marble figure on the dollar bill, but as a man who once woke up in a modest bedroom in Virginia, tied his hair back with a ribbon, pulled on his boots, and began his day just like any other husband, farmer, and neighbor. Long before he carried the weight of a revolution or a presidency, he carried the daily rhythm of Mount Vernon in the spring of 1759. Imagine yourself waking up in that time. The room is quiet, except for the faint crackle of a fire that burned low during the night. The sheets you pull around your shoulders are not crisp cotton like you might know today, but linen worn softer with each wash, a texture smoothed by years of use. The mattress beneath you is filled with goose feathers that have drifted into uneven piles during the night. The scents in the air layer together: wood smoke, a hint of dried rosemary and sage hung from the beams above, and, drifting in faintly, the aroma of bread being baked in the kitchen. From outside come the sounds of a different era. The crow of roosters announcing themselves with pride, wagon wheels beginning to turn, voices of workers heading toward the fields, and the whinny of a horse carried across the still cool morning air. Then you hear another sound, steady footsteps on the wooden floorboards. A tall figure enters, broad-shouldered and upright, his hair still a natural reddish-brown and pulled back neatly into a queue. He is not yet the gray-haired general of paintings, nor the stern president remembered in history. He is 27 years old, steady-eyed and practical. "Good morning," he says, his voice deeper and more resonant than you might expect. He tells you that Martha is still resting and asks if you would care to join him for a ride across the property. And just like that, you are invited into the private world of George Washington at the very start of his married life. This is the Washington many of us rarely picture. He is not in uniform, not standing beneath battle flags, not giving speeches that echo through the centuries. He is a newlywed and a landowner, figuring out how to turn a modest estate into something worthy of his hopes, and his wife standing. In January of 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children, and together they began shaping Mount Vernon into a household that would become both home and symbol. The estate was still modest compared to the grand mansion it would later become, but it already carried the promise of permanence. Riding with him that spring meant seeing fields still in transition, fences that needed mending, and outbuildings that were as much experiments as they were necessities. For George, every detail of this place was more than business. It was a laboratory for testing ideas, a proving ground for his discipline, and a place to practice the skills of management and foresight that he would later carry into national service. Now, pause for a moment and think about the invitation he offered. Picture yourself climbing into the saddle of a gentle mare riding beside Washington as the spring wind carries the scent of tilled earth. He points toward fields where wheat has just begun to push green shoots out of the soil, explains how rotation prevents exhaustion, and gestures toward a distant fence that still needs repair. His tone is practical, even restrained, but beneath it is real enthusiasm. He is not a man reciting chores. He is a man who finds genuine purpose in managing land, animals, and people. In this private world, his leadership shows itself not in stirring words, but in careful habits repeated every morning. Why begin here? Because history often hides the small truths behind the big statues. Washington's greatness, if we want to use that word, was not born fully formed on a battlefield or in a convention hall. It was shaped by mornings like this, where he disciplined himself to rise early, to ride the fields, to take notes, and to make sure small details were handled before they grew into larger problems. In other words, the man who could one day direct an army did not start with soldiers. He started with fields, fences, and schedules, And the man who would one day preside over a nation did not first practice on parliaments. He practiced at his own table, balancing budgets, assigning tasks, and setting priorities in a household that was both complex and fragile. There is also Martha, though she is not yet in the scene of this dawn ride. Her presence is already central. She brings not only land and wealth into the marriage, but also stability, experience, and a kind of practical wisdom that balances George's relentless drive. While he dreams of expansion, she manages the details that make daily life run smoothly. Their partnership begins here, not as a grand romance, but as an arrangement that grows into respect, affection, and eventually love expressed more in action than in words. Without her, Mount Vernon would not have flourished. Without Mount Vernon, George Washington himself might not have been prepared for what history later demanded. So as we start this journey together, think of that image, Washington in his riding boots, notebook tucked in his pocket, scanning the horizon not for armies but for soil conditions, not for politicians but for fence posts. Think of the young man who speaks less than he observes, who finds satisfaction in order, and who, perhaps unknowingly, is preparing for challenges far greater than the day-to-day concerns of a plantation. This is where his private life begins to form the habits that will eventually spill over into public destiny. The ride at dawn is more than a scene. It is a metaphor for how Washington approached life itself. Each morning, he mounted his horse and looked out over his responsibilities. In 1759, those responsibilities were limited to his land, his new wife, and her children. But the practice of carrying them with discipline and steadiness would expand over the years until they encompassed armies, alliances, and a fragile new nation. By following him here into the quiet hours of Mount Vernon, we see not the legend but the man learning step by step how to govern himself, his household, and one day, a country. When George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis in January of 1759, he was not only gaining a wife, but stepping into an entirely new role as the head of a blended family and the manager of a much larger household. Martha was 27, a widow with 2 young children, John Jackie and Martha Patsy. She brought to the marriage not only affection and companionship, but also significant wealth in the form of land, enslaved workers, and financial stability. For George, who had spent much of his early life as a soldier and surveyor, this marriage was more than a turning point. It was the foundation on which his private and public life would rest. What strikes us when we look closely at their partnership is that it was built less on dramatic romance and more on steady compatibility. This is not to say that they felt no affection for one another. On the contrary, their letters and the testimony of those who knew them suggest warmth, humor, and loyalty. But unlike some of the passionate exchanges we read from other figures of the 18th century, George and Martha's affection often appeared in quieter, more practical forms, shared glances across a dinner table, unspoken understanding in managing the estate, and small acts of consideration during long evenings by the fire. Their marriage was not a stage play, but a steady rhythm, and that rhythm gave both of them strength. It is true that, before marrying Martha, George had written letters to Sally Fairfax, the wife of his close friend. These letters, carefully worded, yet revealing hints of longing, have led many historians to speculate about Washington's deeper feelings. Was he truly in love with Sally? Did he marry Martha for security rather than passion? The truth is likely more complicated. By the time George married Martha, his letters to Sally had stopped. Whatever admiration he may have once held for Sally, he chose Martha, and what unfolded over the decades was a relationship grounded in respect, trust, and an evolving affection that carried them through war, loss, and the endless duties of public life. Inside Mount Vernon, their daily partnership was evident in the way responsibilities were shared. George oversaw the broader workings of the plantation, crop rotations, building projects, financial ledgers, and correspondence with business partners. Martha managed the household itself, She supervised the kitchen, oversaw the enslaved domestic workers, planned meals, kept inventories of linens and clothing, ordered supplies, and made sure guests felt welcome. Together they created a household that ran with precision, not extravagance. If George was the engineer of Mount Vernon's outer workings, Martha was the heart that kept its rooms alive. It is easy to imagine the two of them in the evening, after the day's tasks were done. George, perhaps seated with a book on agriculture or military history, his long legs stretched before the fire. Martha, across from him, sewing or writing letters, the soft glow of candlelight falling across her face. They might speak quietly about the children's lessons, the health of the horses, or the latest news from neighbors. There was no need for speeches. Their companionship spoke most clearly in their comfort with silence. In those quiet evenings, Washington was not a commander or a politician. He was a husband, content in the company of a woman who steadied his restless nature. For Martha, this was not always an easy life. She had lost her first husband suddenly and had already learned how fragile security could be. She carried the memory of grief even as she built a new life with George. Later, she would endure the heartbreak of losing her daughter Patsy to illness as a teenager, and eventually her son Jackie as well. Yet through it all, she remained composed, known for her warmth and for the way she could manage a household even under the most stressful circumstances. Those qualities made her indispensable, not only at Mount Vernon, but also later in army camps during the Revolution, where her presence lifted morale among soldiers and officers alike. It is important to note that, while Martha brought wealth into the marriage, George contributed something less tangible but equally valuable: ambition and vision. He wanted to improve Mount Vernon, to experiment with crops, to expand its reach, and to make it not just a working plantation, but a lasting estate. Martha's resources made these goals possible, but George's relentless drive made them real. Their marriage, in that sense, was not just a joining of two people, but a fusion of opportunity and determination. When we think about Washington as a leader, it is easy to picture him, alone on horseback at the head of his troops, or at the podium of a young nation. But the truth is that he was rarely truly alone. Martha was his confidant, his anchor, and the quiet force who made his public service possible. When he accepted the role of commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, it was Martha who traveled to join him in camp, who endured the harsh winters at Valley Forge, and who created small pockets of normal life amid the uncertainty of war. Their partnership extended far beyond Mount Vernon. It was a partnership that carried into every arena of his life. If their love story lacks the fiery language of poetry, it more than makes up for it in resilience. Perhaps that is why their marriage lasted and grew. Theirs was a bond tested by distance, grief, and constant responsibility. But it endured because it was built on something stronger than fleeting passion, the daily practice of loyalty. We see this in the way Washington wrote of her with respect, in the way he deferred to her judgment on matters of the household, and in the way Martha, after his death, would burn many of their private letters, choosing to protect the privacy of their relationship from curious eyes. That act of destruction, while frustrating for historians, may be the most telling of all. It suggests that between them were feelings and exchanges too personal to be put on display. So when we picture George and Martha Washington in 1759, let us not imagine a grand romance written in sonnets. Instead, let us see them in their daily life, a tall, reserved man who found purpose in order, and a capable, steady woman who knew how to turn a house into a haven. Their marriage was the quiet forge in which Washington's character was tempered. In the years ahead, the world would test him in ways almost unimaginable. But the strength he carried into those trials began here, beside Martha, in the shared routines of a marriage that, while born of practicality, blossomed into genuine devotion. Life at Mount Vernon, in the years following George and Martha Washington's marriage, was not grand or ceremonial, but deeply practical. It was a living organism that needed constant care, and both George and Martha understood their roles in keeping it alive. George focused outward, on the land, the crops, the livestock, and the experiments that might improve them. Martha focused inward on the kitchens, the rooms, the clothing, the food, and the dozens of people who made the house function. Together, they created a rhythm that allowed Mount Vernon to become not just a residence, but a model of early American domestic life. If you walked through the house in the morning, you would see Martha already at work. She rose early, often before the sun had climbed high, and consulted with the enslaved cooks and house servants about meals for the day. She checked inventories of flour, salt, sugar, and spices, calculating what must be ordered and what could be stretched a little longer. She kept close account of linens and clothing, making sure that nothing went to waste, and that every family member, Gemmelgauers, and servant had what they needed. Martha's quiet authority could be felt everywhere. It was she who knew what medicines were stocked in the cabinet, which child needed new shoes, and which guest might require special attention at supper. She had lived through loss, and she carried herself with the calm discipline of someone who knew that order was the only defense against chaos. Meanwhile, George was almost always on horseback. By dawn, he was often already out inspecting the fields. He visited the carpenters' sheds, looked in on the smithy, and surveyed fences to see which needed mending. He believed in careful record-keeping, so after his rounds he returned to his study to note the day's observations in his ledgers. Weather, crop growth, animal health, nothing escaped his attention. To him, Mount Vernon was not simply a farm. It was a project, a constant experiment in efficiency and improvement. He tried new methods of plowing, rotated crops to preserve soil health, and even tested different manures to see which produced better yields. He saw agriculture not as drudgery but as a science, and his estate as the laboratory. The rhythms of the household stretched beyond George and Martha. Dozens of enslaved men, women, and children lived and worked at Mount Vernon, assigned to tasks ranging from cooking and cleaning to blacksmithing, carpentry, and field labor. Their lives were bound by the institution of slavery, which George and Martha accepted as the unquestioned norm of their world in 1759. The estate depended on their labor, their skill, and their knowledge. George recognized ability, and sometimes rewarded competence with trust, but it was always within the confines of ownership and control. This reality gave Mount Vernon its wealth, but also its moral contradiction. In private moments, Washington recorded his reliance on enslaved workers as plainly as he recorded crop yields, never fully confronting what it meant until much later in his life. For now, in the years just after his marriage, slavery was part of the machinery of daily life, integrated into every meal served and every wall built. Within the house itself, daily life followed a deliberate rhythm. Breakfast was hearty but not elaborate. Bread, porridge, sometimes ham or eggs, with tea or coffee when available. Midday meals were larger, and suppers could become formal if guests were present. The dining room was always set with care, for Mount Vernon was rarely without company. Neighbors, relatives, traveling politicians, and friends came and went, often unannounced, and Martha was skilled at making them feel welcome. She oversaw the table settings, coordinated the courses, and made sure there was music or conversation afterward to keep the evening lively. The Washingtons were not showy, but their hospitality was genuine, and their home quickly became known as a place where one could expect warmth and order. Evenings often ended with music. Martha played the harpsichord, and George, though not musically inclined himself, enjoyed the sound. Guests would sometimes join in, and the parlor would fill with laughter and conversation. On quieter nights, George might read while Martha sewed, the fire crackling softly between them. These were the private moments that mattered most, when the world seemed distant and the rhythms of home brought peace. Raising children was another part of the daily routine. Though George and Martha never had children together, George took on the role of stepfather to Jackie and Patsy, Martha's children from her first marriage. It was not always an easy adjustment. George was disciplined, sometimes stern, and he expected responsibility and focus. Jackie, in particular, resisted those expectations, preferring fun and social life to studies. Yet George tried, guiding him with the same persistence he gave to crops and fences. With Patsy, who suffered from illness for much of her short life, his tenderness showed through his usually guarded nature. The Washington household, like so many others, balanced discipline with affection, routine with the unpredictability of children. Every corner of Mount Vernon bore signs of this shared life. The gardens grew vegetables and herbs that flavored meals and provided remedies. The dairy produced butter and cheese. The smokehouse preserved meats for winter. The laundry yard was filled with steam and the smell of lye soap on wash days. These details might seem ordinary, but they were the texture of life, and they reveal a household that was never idle. The estate was alive with motion, with people at work, with animals being tended, with the constant push and pull of responsibility. What stands out most is how George and Martha wove their lives together through these routines. She trusted him to manage the broader estate. He trusted her to manage the home. They met in the middle, sharing meals, decisions, and quiet companionship. This partnership grounded them both. For George, who often carried himself with reserve, Martha's steady warmth softened his edges. For Martha, who had already endured loss, George's determination gave her stability. Together, they built not just a house, but a haven, a place that would carry them through the storms of war and the demands of nation-building still to come. So when we think of George Washington's private life at Mount Vernon, let us not picture marble statues or silent portraits. Let us picture linen drying in the wind, the sound of hooves on dirt paths, the rhythm of Martha's voice directing a servant, the scratch of George's pen in his ledger, and the laughter of children echoing in the hall. It was in these moments, ordinary, daily, unremarkable to those living them, that Washington practiced the skills of order, patience, and endurance that would one day serve him on a much larger stage. The private life was never separate from the public life. It was the training ground, and Mount Vernon was both home and classroom for America's future leader. When we peel away the marble busts and solemn oil paintings, George Washington's private life reveals a man who carried within him deep, unspoken conflicts. Perhaps the most human of these conflicts can be found in his letters to Sally Fairfax, a married woman who stirred emotions that Washington never entirely shook. Before he became the father of his country, before he was the general or the president, he was simply a man, young, ambitious, uncertain of his future, and caught between passion and practicality. Sally Carey Fairfax was everything a young colonial gentleman might admire. She was intelligent, cultured, witty, and graceful, belonging to one of the most prominent families in Virginia. Her marriage to George William Fairfax, George Washington's close friend and benefactor, placed her squarely in the elite circle that Washington long aspired to join. The Fairfaxes opened doors for him, doors that connected him to wealth, influence, and refined society. But alongside these practical ties, there were also sparks of something more personal, more dangerous, a quiet affection that grew into longing. The most famous of Washington's letters to Sally was written in September 1758. At the time, George had just returned from service in the French and Indian War, where he had proven himself brave, resilient, and capable of command. Yet in this private letter, his words betray a side of him rarely shown in military reports or public documents. He wrote of her amiable beauties and of tender passages shared in memory. By the standards of the 18th century, the language was bold, emotional, even romantic. These were not idle words. They carried the weight of feelings George could never fully act upon. It is important to pause here and imagine the risk. Sally was not only married, but married to one of Washington's closest friends. To confess such sentiments, even obliquely, was to step dangerously close to scandal. But young Washington was still learning how to master his emotions, how to balance the private impulses of the heart with the strict codes of honor that governed his world. In Sally, he glimpsed a possibility of romance, intimacy, and cultural refinement. In Martha, whom he would soon marry, he saw stability, partnership, and a secure foundation for his ambitions. This tension raises a timeless question. Do we choose love, or do we choose security? For Washington, the choice was clear enough, though perhaps painful. He married Martha Dandridge Custis in January 1759, only months after writing to Sally. Martha was a widow with 2 young children and one of the largest fortunes in Virginia. Their union instantly elevated Washington's standing, giving him land, wealth, and social position far beyond what he had before. If Sally was the flame of youthful passion, Martha was the anchor of mature responsibility. Historians debate whether George ever truly loved Sally in the way modern readers imagine. Was it infatuation, admiration, a fleeting attraction magnified by circumstance? The truth is probably a mixture of all three. What we do know is that Washington treasured her memory, and the letter remains a rare glimpse into a heart otherwise hidden behind reserve. Throughout his life, he projected dignity, stoicism, and control, but in that single letter, we hear the vulnerable voice of a man daring to confess what he could not openly pursue. For Sally herself, the situation was complicated, but not unusual for her era. Women of high society often received admiration, even poetic letters, from men who respected the boundary of marriage but sought a private channel to express devotion. Whether she encouraged George's feelings or merely tolerated them remains uncertain. Their social circles overlapped for decades, and there is no evidence that scandal ever erupted. That suggests both Sally and George managed the situation with discretion, allowing sentiment to linger unspoken while maintaining the appearance of propriety. The choice Washington made to marry Martha was not simply a strategic decision. It was also a lesson in the kind of self-discipline that would define him later. The young man who once wrote impassioned words to another man's wife grew into the leader who embodied restraint, who believed that a gentleman must master his emotions rather than be mastered by them. His marriage to Martha gave him not only wealth, but also a partner who steadied his restless nature. In her he found affection, order, and a shared vision of domestic life. And yet, the shadow of Sally Fairfax never fully vanished. Decades later, during the Revolutionary War, George and Sally corresponded again, though in far more restrained terms. By then, George was no longer the uncertain young officer longing for recognition. He was a seasoned leader, cautious about every word. Still, the earlier letter survives as evidence of the young man he once was: ambitious, yearning, and not entirely immune to the pull of forbidden affection. Reflecting on this today, we see not scandal but humanity. George Washington, like anyone else, carried within him the tension between desire and duty. His letter to Sally reminds us that even the most celebrated figures in history were once vulnerable, conflicted, and uncertain. We might even say that the private discipline he learned in matters of the heart prepared him for the far greater discipline required in matters of state. In modern terms, it is easy to imagine Washington as the stern face on a dollar bill, or the towering figure in a general's uniform. But the young man who wrote to Sally Fairfax reminds us that he was also once a person who wrestled with longing and choice, who felt the sting of unattainable love, and who ultimately chose the steadier path of responsibility. This humanizes him in a way that no monument or portrait ever could. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson of this episode. True greatness is not the absence of desire, but the ability to balance desire with principle. Washington may have carried a quiet flame for Sally in his heart, but he built his life with Martha, and in doing so laid the foundation for his future as a leader. The strength to make that choice, the choice of discipline over passion, of duty over impulse, was not a small thing. It was the first step toward the character that would one day guide a nation. When George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis on a cold January day in 1759, he was not yet the towering figure of American legend. He was a 27-year-old former officer, ambitious but restless, just returned from war. Martha was a wealthy widow of 27, mother of 2 small children, and mistress of one of the largest fortunes in Virginia. Their marriage was practical in many ways, but it quickly grew into something deeper, a partnership that blended affection, mutual respect, and shared responsibility. To understand the private Washington, one must understand the quiet but steady foundation that this marriage provided. Martha's presence at Mount Vernon transformed the estate into a true home. She arrived with her children, Jackie and Patsy, bringing with her the warmth of family life and the dignity of her own social position. George, who had known loss early in his life and had spent his 20s in military camps and wilderness expeditions, suddenly found himself not just a husband but a stepfather. It was a role for which he had little preparation, yet one he accepted with characteristic seriousness. He was never the most natural with children, but he made genuine efforts, particularly as the years went on. Martha, for her part, embraced her new life with energy. She was petite, barely 5 feet tall, but carried herself with authority. Portraits often fail to capture her liveliness, but those who met her spoke of her intelligence, her good humor, and her strength of character. She managed household affairs with precision, directing enslaved servants, organizing meals, overseeing accounts, and ensuring that Mount Vernon reflected not only prosperity but also refinement. Visitors noticed her warmth and hospitality, traits that would later shine when she accompanied George to army camps or entertained at the presidential mansion. The question that lingers in historical accounts is whether George and Martha's marriage was one of love, convenience, or both. Certainly, George's letters to Sally Fairfax suggest that he felt romantic passion for another woman just months before his wedding. But whatever doubts he may have carried into marriage, they did not prevent him from forming a genuine bond with Martha. Over time, their union revealed itself as a partnership of equals, unusual in an age when marriages were often dominated entirely by the husband. George respected Martha's judgment. He consulted her on household matters, trusted her to manage finances, and valued her presence as a steadying influence in times of stress. At the dinner table, the family life of the Washingtons unfolded in scenes both ordinary and telling. Martha ensured her children were taught proper manners, while George balanced formality with occasional attempts at warmth. Guests saw in them not grand displays of passion, but a quiet companionship that spoke volumes. Martha, with her easy laughter and calm authority, softened George's reserve. George, with his sense of duty and persistence, provided Martha with stability and protection. Together, they created a household that blended affection with discipline, comfort with responsibility. Their marriage also survived trials that might have broken a weaker bond. Patsy suffered from recurring seizures, and George's compassion during her illness revealed a side of him rarely seen in public. When she died as a teenager, both George and Martha were devastated. Jackie, too, tested George's patience with his indifference to study and preference for social life. Yet George continued to guide him as best he could, and later, when Jackie died young during the Revolutionary War, George and Martha stepped in to raise 2 of his children as their own. Parenthood, in their household, was always a patchwork of devotion, duty, and adaptation. What made their marriage remarkable was not fiery romance, but resilience. George and Martha built a life that endured separations during war, political pressures, and the strain of public life. Martha followed George to military encampments during the Revolution, living in harsh conditions so she could support him. She managed Mount Vernon in his absence, ensuring that the estate remained productive even while her husband was away for years. She read his moods, soothed his frustrations, and provided the private companionship he needed when the weight of command grew unbearable. When George later became president, Martha again adapted. She disliked public life, calling herself a prisoner in the ceremonial role of First Lady, but she fulfilled her duties with dignity. She hosted gatherings, maintained the household, and presented a gracious image to visitors from across the new nation. Privately, she longed for the day when she and George could return to Mount Vernon and live in peace. Their shared dream was not one of endless power or recognition, but of retreat to their beloved estate. It is telling that George Washington, who could have had his choice of many companions in society, trusted Martha implicitly. He shared with her the burdens of leadership, and while he was not a man prone to open displays of emotion, those who observed them together noticed the tenderness in small gestures, a hand placed on the shoulder, a glance across a crowded room, a private smile when she played music in the parlor. Affection between them was not loud, but it was unmistakable. In reflecting on their marriage, we see the roots of Washington's broader leadership style. Just as he respected Martha's contributions at home, he respected the input of others in political and military life. Just as he valued partnership in his private world, he valued consensus in his public one. His ability to listen, to compromise, and to place stability above passion echoed the lessons of his own household. Mount Vernon was not just his refuge. It was the place where he practiced the art of shared responsibility. So when we ask whether George and Martha Washington's marriage was one of love or convenience, the answer may be both and more. It was a union that began with practical considerations, but grew into a partnership that weathered grief, war, and the demands of history. It was not marked by fireworks, but by a steady flame that lit their home and gave Washington the grounding he needed to carry the weight of a nation. In the end, perhaps the true measure of their affection lies not in romantic letters, but in the quiet details of daily life. Martha preparing his favorite wine at dinner, George standing silently on the porch beside her, both gazing at the Potomac in companionable silence. That was their love story. Unassuming, resilient, and profoundly human. If there was one passion George Washington carried throughout his life outside of war and politics, it was farming. To picture him solely as the general on horseback or the stoic president in portraits is to miss an essential part of who he really was. At heart, Washington considered himself first and foremost a farmer. Mount Vernon was not only his home but also his laboratory, a place where he experimented with methods, crops, and tools that many of his contemporaries dismissed as unnecessary. Long before the word innovation became a buzzword, Washington embodied it in the soil of Virginia. The tobacco fields of colonial Virginia had been both the fortune and the curse of planters for decades. Tobacco sold well, but it drained the land, stripping the soil of nutrients and leaving behind fields that could no longer sustain crops. Many planters simply abandoned exhausted fields and cleared more forest. Washington thought differently. He believed that land should be preserved and improved rather than used up and discarded. To him, good stewardship of the soil was not only wise for his estate, but a moral duty to future generations. So he shifted Mount Vernon away from tobacco and toward wheat and diversified crops. This decision was bold because tobacco was still the money crop of Virginia, but Washington recognized the long-term risks of dependence. Wheat allowed for more stable yields, and from it he could produce flour, which became a valuable export. His flour was even branded with his name and shipped as far as the Caribbean and Europe. For a man we often think of in terms of muskets and constitutions, it is striking to realize that he was also a businessman whose reputation reached distant markets through barrels of grain. But Washington's vision went beyond just planting wheat. He rotated crops, wheat, corn, clover, flax, and vegetables long before it became common practice in America. He experimented with fertilizers, testing manure from cattle, horses, and sheep to see which improved yields most effectively. He recorded weather patterns, soil conditions, and results in careful notebooks. He was not content to rely on tradition or guesswork. He wanted data, evidence, and proof. In this sense, Washington was a scientist of the land, blending hands-on labor with the intellectual curiosity of the Enlightenment. One of his greatest prides was the construction of a 16-sided barn, a design that allowed for more efficient threshing of wheat. Horses could be driven in circles around the interior. trampling the wheat heads on the upper floor, while the grain fell through gaps to the floor below for easy collection. This was not just clever, it was revolutionary for its time. Visitors who saw the barn often wrote about it with admiration, noting how Washington's innovations set him apart from other planters. He also invested in mills. A grist mill at Mount Vernon allowed him to grind flour for local sale and export, while later, after his presidency, he added one of the largest whiskey distilleries in the young nation. Producing nearly 11,000 gallons a year, it was a thriving business, and yet Washington never viewed it simply as profit. For him, it was always part of a broader plan, making Mount Vernon self-sufficient, diversified, and sustainable. Washington's attention to farming extended beyond his own estate. He corresponded with agricultural societies in England and Europe, importing clover seed, improved plows, and treatises on farming methods. He read voraciously and was never too proud to borrow ideas. If a new tool might save labor, or a foreign crop might enrich the soil, he wanted to test it. His hunger to learn mirrored the way he approached leadership, later absorbing ideas, weighing evidence, and applying the best practices available. There was also a personal satisfaction in farming that Washington never found in politics. Riding through his fields, inspecting fences, speaking with overseers, and even walking the rows of wheat gave him a sense of control and peace. In war, he often felt at the mercy of Congress, the weather, or the movements of the enemy. In politics, compromise and factional disputes frustrated him. But at Mount Vernon, with the soil beneath his boots and the river glistening in the distance, he felt mastery over something real and enduring. Of course, the darker truth was that these agricultural experiments rested on the labor of enslaved men, women, and children. They plowed the fields, tended the crops, built the barns, and operated the mills. Washington relied on their skill and strength while gradually, painfully, wrestling with the moral contradiction of advocating liberty while perpetuating slavery. To his credit, he valued their expertise, often asking for advice from experienced blacksmiths, carpenters, and field hands. But it was still within the confines of ownership. This reality makes his agricultural success inseparable from the injustice that enabled it. Yet, even within this context, Washington's agricultural innovations left a legacy that extended beyond Mount Vernon. His crop rotation methods, barn design, and commitment to sustainability were studied by other planters and admired by foreign visitors. In a very real sense, Washington's contributions to American agriculture paralleled his contributions to American politics. He set precedents, modeled discipline, and demonstrated that long-term thinking could yield stability. Imagine him at dusk, standing at the edge of a field freshly plowed, his boots sinking slightly into the rich soil. The air carries the scent of earth and wood smoke, while horses graze nearby. His mind, always alert, is already considering the next season, how the wheat will fare, whether the clover will restore the soil, what adjustments the fences might need. To him, farming was not a retreat from responsibility, but an expression of it. Each decision mattered. Each experiment built toward a vision of prosperity that outlasted him. So while history remembers George Washington as the victorious general and the dignified president, we should also remember him as the farmer who cared deeply about the land. The lessons he practiced at Mount Vernon, discipline, patience, foresight, and a relentless pursuit of improvement, were the same qualities that guided him in leading an army and a nation. His farm was more than property. It was a training ground for the habits of mind and character that defined him. In the soil of Mount Vernon, George Washington found both his refuge and his calling. And perhaps that is the truest portrait of the man, not the uniform, not the formal pose in Philadelphia, but the farmer in muddy boots, notebook in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon, forever seeking ways to make the future more fruitful than the past. To speak honestly about George Washington's private life at Mount Vernon, we cannot look only at the idyllic scenes of family meals, agricultural experiments, and peaceful evenings by the fire. Behind those moments lay the labor of hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children, whose unchosen work sustained every aspect of Washington's household. Their presence is an inescapable part of his legacy, and their lives remind us that even the man who led a nation in pursuit of liberty lived within the contradiction of owning human beings. When Washington married Martha Custis, he not only gained land and wealth, but also inherited the large number of enslaved workers that had belonged to her late husband's estate. Combined with those he had already inherited from his own family, the population of enslaved people at Mount Vernon quickly grew. By the time of his death in 1799, there were more than 300 enslaved individuals living and working on the estate. In 1759, during the years of his early marriage, there were fewer, but even then the plantation's prosperity depended on their labor. The roles assigned to the enslaved community were diverse. Field hands worked long hours in the heat and cold, planting and harvesting wheat, corn, and other crops. Skilled laborers, blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, and seamstresses used their expertise to maintain the estate's buildings, tools, and clothing. Cooks and house servants managed the kitchens, served meals, cleaned, laundered, and tended to the daily comfort of the Washington family and their guests. Even the smallest children were drawn into this cycle, fetching water, gathering wood, or tending animals. Visitors to Mount Vernon sometimes remarked on how efficiently the estate was run, praising Washington's order and discipline. But what they rarely acknowledged was that this efficiency was built on coerced labor. Washington himself recognized the skill of many enslaved workers, often noting their competence in his ledgers, or listening to their suggestions in practical matters. He trusted Neptune, his blacksmith, to craft tools. He acknowledged the abilities of William, his carpenter, who could fashion complex wooden structures. He allowed cooks like Lucy to plan meals using both garden produce and imported spices. Yet all of this recognition was framed by ownership. No matter how talented or essential, these individuals remained property under Virginia law, unable to claim the fruits of their labor or control their own destinies. In his early years, Washington accepted slavery as the natural order of life in Virginia. He had inherited enslaved workers at the age of 11 when his father died, and grew up in a culture where slavery was woven into the fabric of society. He was not initially inclined to question it. Like many planters, he saw enslaved people as both labor and financial assets. His records speak of births, deaths, illnesses, and transfers with the same detached tone he used for crops and livestock. To the modern ear, this is chilling, but it was the reality of his world. And yet, Washington was not entirely blind to the contradiction. Even in the 1760s and 1770s, as he built Mount Vernon into a thriving estate, he expressed discomfort with the inefficiency of slavery. He noted that enslaved workers had little incentive to labor diligently since they did not benefit directly from their efforts. At times he considered shifting to a system of renting laborers or hiring free workers. But the economic and social structures of Virginia made such changes difficult. His wealth and status were tied to the very institution he began to question. This tension deepened after the Revolutionary War. Having fought for independence under the banner of liberty, Washington could not entirely escape the irony of returning to a home sustained by slavery. Correspondence from his later years shows a gradual shift. He stopped buying new slaves. He quietly began planning how he might arrange for their eventual freedom, even as he struggled with the legal complications of Martha's dower slaves, those belonging to her first husband's estate, which she did not fully control. In his will, Washington took the remarkable step of ordering that all the enslaved individuals he owned outright be freed after Martha's death. This decision, radical for a Virginia planter of his status, showed that the seeds of moral awareness had grown within him, though they came too late for many who lived their lives in bondage at Mount Vernon. But in 1759, when we imagine walking with Washington across the plantation, We must see what he saw: enslaved men mending fences, women hanging laundry, children carrying water. We must hear the sound of hammers in the blacksmith's forge, smell the smoke from the kitchen where enslaved cooks worked from before dawn until late at night, and feel the weight of the contradiction pressing silently on every corner of the estate. Washington greeted these individuals by name, valued their skills, even rewarded them with extra rations or clothing at times. Yet he never, at this stage of his life, extended to them the freedom he himself treasured. To confront this reality is not to diminish Washington's achievements, but to humanize him fully. He was not a flawless hero, but a man shaped by his culture, struggling with its injustices and slowly evolving in his understanding. His legacy includes both the leadership that secured independence and the ownership that denied it to others. Mount Vernon was a place of innovation and hospitality, but also of bondage and suffering. To remember both is to honor the truth. For us today, Washington's relationship with slavery serves as a reminder that even great leaders can be bound by the blind spots of their time. The challenge is not to excuse it, but to learn from it, to see how individuals can change, how awareness can grow, and how contradictions can push societies to evolve. The story of Mount Vernon's enslaved community is inseparable from the story of George Washington, because without them, his daily life, his experiments, his comforts, and even his family meals would not have been possible. So when we picture Washington at Mount Vernon, we should imagine not only the dignified figure inspecting his fields, but also the many men and women laboring in those fields under compulsion. We should hear not only the quiet of his study, but also the clatter of pots in the kitchen where enslaved hands prepared his meals. We should see not only Martha in her parlor, but also the seamstresses sewing garments late into the night. Only then do we glimpse the full reality of his private life, the contradiction at its core, where liberty and bondage lived side by side. Life at Mount Vernon was never truly isolated. Though the estate stood proudly on its bluff overlooking the Potomac, separated from towns and cities by miles of rough roads and forests, there was still a hub of social exchange. George and Martha Washington understood that hospitality was both duty and opportunity. Their home became a revolving door for neighbors, political acquaintances, distant relatives, and visiting dignitaries. This constant rhythm of guests shaped the Washingtons' private life, blending intimacy with performance and grounding them in a network of relationships that would influence George's future. On any given week, Mount Vernon might host visitors from Alexandria or Williamsburg merchants, officers, and fellow planters. The Washingtons extended warm welcomes, offering hearty meals, music in the parlor, and thoughtful conversation. Hospitality was more than politeness. It was a form of reputation building. In colonial Virginia, a gentleman's standing depended as much on how he entertained as on how he farmed. Washington, though naturally reserved, mastered the art of listening. He let others speak at length, absorbing details, weighing opinions, and offering measured responses. This skill, honed around his dining table, would later serve him well in councils of war and presidential debates. Martha, meanwhile, shone as hostess. She orchestrated the household with quiet efficiency, ensuring that guests felt both welcomed and impressed. She managed enslaved servants discreetly, guiding the flow of meals and conversation with practiced ease. Her warmth and composure softened George's formality, creating an atmosphere where visitors lingered comfortably. Many left Mount Vernon not only fed but charmed, carrying stories of the Washingtons' grace back to their communities. Among the most significant guests were the Fairfaxes. George William Fairfax and his wife Sally were more than neighbors. They were the couple whose influence had profoundly shaped George's early life. George William had been mentor, patron, and friend, introducing the young Washington to the circles of wealth and refinement that might otherwise have remained closed. Sally, of course, had once been the object of George's youthful affection, preserved forever in those private letters. Their visits to Mount Vernon brought with them a mixture of familiarity, gratitude, and unspoken tension. Imagine such an evening. The Fairfax carriage arriving at dusk, its lanterns glowing against the Virginia twilight. George greets William with genuine warmth, the two men clasping hands and quickly diving into talk of politics, land surveys, and business ventures. Their conversation carries the ease of long friendship, marked by shared history and mutual respect. Meanwhile, Martha and Sally exchange pleasantries in the parlor, discussing children, fashion, and recent correspondence from England. On the surface, it is all gracious civility. Beneath the surface, for George at least, there may still linger a faint echo of past feelings, though carefully buried beneath duty and discretion. Guests to Mount Vernon often marveled at the balance of formality and comfort. Dinner might include imported wines and delicacies from the garden, served on fine china, yet the atmosphere was not stiff. George asked thoughtful questions about crops, politics, or travel. Martha steered conversation with her warmth, ensuring quieter voices were heard. Afterward, guests moved to the parlor, where music filled the room. Sally Fairfax playing the harpsichord with elegance, Martha offering a simpler but heartfelt tune, George watching with quiet pride. These evenings were not just social occasions. They were opportunities to cement alliances, exchange information, and strengthen bonds that would prove vital in years to come. The Washingtons also maintained strong ties with local neighbors. They joined hunting parties, attended dances, and hosted gatherings that often stretched late into the night. George loved fox hunting in particular, riding with skill and enthusiasm that impressed even seasoned horsemen. These hunts were both sport and social ritual, occasions for men of the gentry to display skill, courage, and camaraderie. They also provided moments when Washington, usually so serious, could show flashes of joy and competitiveness, his laughter ringing across the fields. Mount Vernon's social world also extended beyond elite families. Merchants and tradesmen called regularly to deliver goods or negotiate contracts. George dealt with them directly, always courteous but firm, ensuring fair transactions that sustained his estate's needs. Enslaved laborers, too, formed part of this broader social fabric. Though always from a position of inequality, Washington might acknowledge their contributions with words of praise, yet their presence at dinners was limited to serving dishes or tending fires visible, essential, but rarely recognized as individuals in the formal life of the household. Visitors frequently remarked on the Washingtons' ability to make Mount Vernon feel both grand and welcoming. The estate itself, with its growing wings and carefully planned gardens, projected refinement. Yet George and Martha ensured that their guests felt at ease, not overawed. This balance of dignity and approachability mirrored Washington's later leadership style, commanding respect without arrogance, inspiring loyalty without theatricality. The Fairfax connection deserves special attention, for it reveals the subtle interplay between George's personal feelings and his public role. The Fairfaxes were loyal to Britain during the coming Revolution, eventually leaving for England, while George would become the face of independence. Yet the bond between George William Fairfax and Washington endured, despite politics. As for Sally, whatever unspoken emotions remained, they were sublimated into lifelong courtesy and distance. Their presence in Mount Vernon's social life was a reminder that even in his private world, Washington navigated layers of duty, affection, and restraint. Looking back, one can see how these evenings at Mount Vernon were more than just hospitality. They were training grounds for leadership. Washington learned patience by listening to the opinions of neighbors, even when he disagreed. He practiced diplomacy by maintaining warm relations with families of differing loyalties. He refined his image by creating a home that spoke of stability and refinement, qualities that made others trust him. All of this unfolded, not in the grand halls of power, but in the candlelit rooms of his own home. So when we think of George Washington's private life, We should remember the parlor filled with music, the dining table alive with conversation, the fields echoing with fox hunts, and the quiet exchanges between neighbors who shaped his world. Mount Vernon was not only a sanctuary, but also a stage, a place where George and Martha Washington rehearsed the roles of host and hostess, partners whose private life prepared them for the public destiny ahead. To understand George Washington and his private life is to recognize that he was, above all else, a man of reserve. From an early age, he trained himself to keep emotions under control, to speak carefully, and to present a steady image of composure. Guests at Mount Vernon often described him as dignified, deliberate, sometimes even austere. He did not fill rooms with chatter, nor did he indulge in dramatic displays of feeling. Instead, he listened more than he spoke, measured his words when he did respond, and cultivated an air of self-possession that left a lasting impression. This reserve was not simply a quirk of personality, but the result of conscious effort. As a teenager, Washington had copied out in his handwriting a collection of maxims known as the rules of civility and decent behavior. These principles, borrowed from European etiquette, emphasized restraint, politeness, and respect for others. Washington took them to heart, practicing them until they became second nature. He believed that appearances mattered, that how one carried oneself in public shaped not only reputation, but also inner character. Over time, his careful observance of these rules created the impression of a man who was unshakable, dignified, and above the passions of ordinary life. Yet beneath this surface of composure lay a man of very human emotions. Those who knew him best, Martha, close friends, and trusted aides, saw glimpses of warmth that rarely emerged in public. He could laugh heartily at a good story, show genuine tenderness toward children, and express affection through quiet gestures rather than grand declarations. His stepdaughter Patsy, before her untimely death, remembered his gentleness during her seizures, holding her hand and comforting her with patience. His step-grandchildren, whom he helped raise after Jackie's death, recalled rides, games, and the protective presence of a grandfather who, despite his stern exterior, loved deeply. Even with Martha, affection was expressed not in fiery words, but in steady companionship. They spent long evenings together in silence, their bond evident in small details, a shared glance, a hand resting lightly on hers, a soft smile across the parlor. When separated by war or politics, Washington wrote letters that were brief and formal, but his actions spoke more loudly than his words. He ensured her comfort, welcomed her presence at military camps, and trusted her with the running of Mount Vernon during his absence. For a man trained to keep feelings hidden, these quiet acts were his truest expressions of love. His self-discipline extended beyond emotions into every aspect of daily life. Washington's routines at Mount Vernon were strict. He rose early, often before sunrise, and began his day with correspondence, reading, or inspecting his estate. He ate modestly, preferring simple foods and avoiding excess. He drank in moderation, rarely overindulging in the heavy drinking that was common among his peers. He exercised restraint in gambling and cards, activities that ruined many gentlemen of his generation. To visitors, this discipline made him seem almost severe, but it was the foundation of his strength. Even his physical presence was marked by control. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with military posture, his movements deliberate, and his gaze steady. Contemporary accounts often remark on the force of his presence, describing how he could command attention without speaking a word. This aura was not accidental. Washington understood that leadership required more than words. It required the projection of steadiness. By holding himself in reserve, he allowed others to project onto him the qualities they most admired: strength, wisdom, reliability. At the same time, this restraint could make him difficult to know. Friends sometimes found him distant. Political allies occasionally mistook his silence for disapproval. Even Martha admitted that her husband kept certain parts of himself hidden, not from distrust but from habit. He had built walls around his inner life, and only a select few were ever allowed through. Yet those who did see beyond the reserve consistently spoke of his kindness, his sense of humor, and his quiet generosity. In private moments, Washington did indulge certain passions. He loved the theater, enjoyed dancing, and relished fox hunting with an almost boyish enthusiasm. On the dance floor, he could be surprisingly light-footed, moving with grace that belied his imposing frame. During hunts, he laughed easily with companions, pushing his horse to keep up with the hounds. Returning mud, splattered and exhilarated. These glimpses remind us that his reserve was not the absence of feeling, but the careful management of it. He allowed joy in spaces where it would not compromise his dignity. His correspondence also reveals flashes of emotion, carefully tucked within formal language. Letters to friends occasionally include dry wit or gentle teasing. Notes to Martha, though often destroyed by her after his death, show signs of tender concern. His rare confessions of frustration about Congress, about ill-supplied troops, about the burdens of command, show that beneath the calm exterior beat the heart of a man who felt deeply, even if he rarely displayed it. The hidden warmth of Washington's character was perhaps most visible in his treatment of those he considered loyal. He rewarded trust with trust, often elevating aides, overseers, or servants who proved reliable. Though he lived in a society marked by hierarchy and inequality, he valued competence wherever he found it. This earned him loyalty that endured through hardships, from the frozen camps of Valley Forge to the daily grind of Mount Vernon. People followed Washington, not because he was loud or flamboyant, but because his steadiness inspired confidence. This balance of reserve and hidden warmth made Washington both enigmatic and compelling. He was not the sort of leader to inspire through fiery speeches. He left that to men like Patrick Henry or Thomas Jefferson. Instead, his strength lay in presence, in example, and in the quiet discipline that others could rely on. In his private life, the same qualities shaped his marriage, his household, and his friendships. He was not easy to read, but he was constant, and in that constancy lay his greatest gift. So when we imagine Washington at Mount Vernon, we should picture more than the silent figure writing in his study, or the stern host at his dining table. We should also imagine the man who, when no one was watching, laughed with children, danced with surprising grace, or leaned close to Martha with a private smile. The reserve was real, but so was the warmth hidden behind it. Together they form the character of a man who, in both private and public life, learned to master himself so that he might guide others. If you wanted to understand George Washington not through his speeches or portraits, but through the rhythm of his days, Mount Vernon was the place to see it. Here, away from the noise of politics and war, his daily routine revealed the habits that shaped both his private and public life. Washington believed that discipline in small things created the foundation for greatness in larger things. And nowhere was that more visible than in the pattern of his mornings, his meals, his correspondence, and his evenings at home. He was an early riser, often awake before the sun had fully risen over the Potomac. The quiet of dawn suited him. He valued the stillness, the cool air, and the sense of beginning each day with order. Before most of his household stirred, he was already in his study. There, at a desk, often stacked with ledgers, letters, and weather notes, he read, wrote, and planned. His correspondence was enormous. Neighbors, business partners, military contacts, and political figures all sought his attention. Washington believed in answering letters promptly, often drafting several before breakfast. He kept his handwriting neat, his tone polite but firm, and his instructions precise. To him, letters were not just communication, but a record of responsibility, a way of keeping his world organized. After correspondence, he would ride out across the estate. These rides were a kind of inspection tour, part practical necessity and part ritual. Washington believed a master must know every detail of his land and operations. He rode with keen eyes, noting which fences sagged, which fields drained poorly, which barns needed repair. He greeted overseers, asked questions, and issued instructions. Sometimes he carried a notebook to jot quick observations. Other times, he relied on memory, later recording details in his ledgers. Rain or shine, these rides were rarely skipped. They gave him both exercise and a sense of command over his world. Breakfast was modest but hearty. It usually consisted of hoe cakes, griddle cakes made from cornmeal, served with butter and honey, along with tea or coffee. Guests sometimes joined the family, and though the meal was simple, Martha ensured it was well prepared and pleasant. George ate without fuss, never one for indulgence. He valued nourishment over luxury, a pattern that reflected his larger philosophy of life. Food was important, but discipline mattered more. The rest of the morning might be spent in meetings with estate managers, carpenters, or merchants. Washington's attention to detail could seem relentless. He inspected receipts, checked weights of flour, and reviewed bills with the same seriousness he applied to military orders. He saw the running of Mount Vernon as training in leadership. If he could manage a household well, he could manage greater responsibilities. By noon, he often returned to his study to continue correspondence, balancing estate matters with letters to friends and, in later years, political associates. Dinner, the largest meal of the day, was served in the early afternoon, often around 3 of the clock. This was the centerpiece of Mount Vernon's social life. Guests, neighbors, and travelers frequently joined the Washingtons at their long dining table. The meal could last 2 hours, with multiple courses of meats, vegetables, pies, and puddings. Imported wines were poured alongside cider and beer. Conversation flowed, though George himself spoke sparingly. He preferred listening, asking questions, and letting others carry the discussion. Martha, with her warmth and tact, ensured the atmosphere was lively but gracious. For George, the meal was both nourishment and performance, a way of reinforcing his reputation as a gentleman of refinement and stability. After dinner, Washington often returned to his outdoor activities. He inspected gardens, oversaw building projects, or rode again across distant parts of the estate. These tasks were not merely work. They were expressions of his philosophy that a man should never be idle. Even in the late afternoon, when many might rest, Washington preferred motion. His tall figure on horseback became a familiar sight to everyone at Mount Vernon, a symbol of diligence and authority. Evenings were quieter and more intimate. Supper was lighter, often bread, cheese, or leftovers from dinner. The family gathered in the parlor, where Martha sometimes played the harpsichord or led small sewing circles with guests. Washington might read newspapers, review reports, or simply sit with Martha in comfortable silence. Visitors sometimes noted how peaceful the evenings felt, the rhythm of conversation blending with the crackle of the fireplace. For Washington, these hours were a relief after the constant demands of correspondence and estate management. He also valued reading in the evenings. Books on agriculture, history, or politics often occupied his attention. He was not a philosopher in the abstract sense, but a practical reader, searching for ideas he could apply. A treatise on farming might inspire a new crop rotation. A history of ancient republics might shape his thoughts on government. Reading was part of his self-discipline, a way of sharpening his mind, as surely as riding sharpened his body. By 10 of the clock, the household usually retired. Washington valued regular rest and believed a man should rise early and sleep early. His room was plain, furnished for comfort rather than extravagance. Before sleep, he sometimes wrote a final note, or read a brief passage by candlelight. Then, as the estate settled into silence, he closed his eyes, ready to rise again before dawn and repeat the pattern that anchored his life. The rhythm of Washington's days may sound ordinary, even rigid. But in that very ordinariness lay his strength. He believed that greatness was built not on bursts of brilliance, but on steady discipline, repeated daily. His mornings of correspondence trained him to communicate clearly. His inspections of fields trained him to observe keenly and decide practically. His dinners with guests trained him to listen and lead through example. His evenings of reading and reflection trained him to think beyond the present moment. So when we picture Washington at Mount Vernon, we should not see only the grand general or the solemn president. We should also see the man rising at dawn to write letters by candlelight, the farmer riding muddy paths to check on fences, the gentleman hosting neighbors at a simple but gracious dinner, and the husband sitting quietly by the fire with Martha. In the rhythm of these days, Washington shaped the character that would one day carry him through war and presidency. His greatness began not with declarations or battles, but with the patient discipline of ordinary hours well spent. To understand George Washington fully, one must hold in mind the tension between the man at Mount Vernon and the man on the public stage. His private life and his public life were not two separate identities, but two sides of the same coin, constantly influencing each other. Mount Vernon was his refuge, the place where he found order, discipline, and family. Yet the wider world called him repeatedly into service, first as a soldier, then as a general, and finally as a president. The contrast between the quiet of his estate and the noise of public life reveals how Washington balanced his deepest longing for privacy with his duty to serve. At Mount Vernon, Washington's life followed a steady rhythm. He rose before dawn, tended to correspondence, inspected his fields, dined with Martha and their guests, and ended evenings with books or conversation by the fire. It was predictable, grounded, and deeply personal. In these routines, he felt control over his time, his household, his crops, and his relationships. The farm was a microcosm where discipline yielded results, where order prevailed, and where his authority was unquestioned. This life satisfied the farmer, husband, and thinker in him. Public life, by contrast, was chaotic, unpredictable, and often frustrating. As commander of the Continental Army, he faced shortages of supplies, untrained soldiers, constant political interference, and the uncertainties of war. He could no longer control every detail, nor could he guarantee outcomes. His patience was tested daily, his composure strained. Where Mount Vernon gave him peace, the battlefield gave him anxiety. Where his estate rewarded steady labor, politics often rewarded manipulation and compromise. Washington despised intrigue, yet he found himself surrounded by it in Philadelphia and New York. And yet, the two lives informed one another. The habits of self-discipline, observation, and steadiness that he practiced at Mount Vernon became the qualities that made him effective in war and politics. He approached his army as he approached his farm, taking stock, making careful adjustments, rewarding competence, and never panicking in the face of setbacks. He viewed politics the same way. Frustrating though it was, he treated it as another field to manage, another set of challenges to face with patience rather than passion. Without the grounding of Mount Vernon, it is hard to imagine Washington maintaining the composure that history remembers. But if Mount Vernon trained him for leadership, it also pulled at him with constant longing. Letters from Washington during the Revolution are filled with expressions of homesickness. He wrote of his desire to return to my peaceful abode, where every moment brings satisfaction. He missed the rides across his fields, the quiet suppers with Martha, the steady rhythm of farming. Even as he guided armies across frozen landscapes or endured the politics of Congress, he dreamed of his farm. Friends, aides noted how often he spoke of returning, of being done with public life once the war was over. This same conflict returned during his presidency. Washington never sought the role. He accepted it reluctantly, believing it his duty rather than his desire. In Philadelphia and New York, he carried himself with dignity, shaping the presidency into a model of restraint and authority. But privately, he confided his longing for Mount Vernon. He disliked the constant attention, the endless formal dinners, and the ceremonial obligations that bound him. He referred to himself, half-jokingly, as a prisoner of state. His letters reveal that he counted the days until he could finally step away and return home. Martha felt this contrast just as keenly. She too longed for Mount Vernon whenever she was drawn into war camps or political centers. She wrote of the strain of public life, of how much she valued the privacy of their estate. Together, they carried the burden of being symbols while quietly yearning for ordinary days. Their shared dream was not of power, but of retreat. That dream only grew stronger with time. What makes Washington remarkable is that he never allowed his personal longing to eclipse his public duty. He accepted command when others doubted him. He served as president when others feared the republic might collapse without his steady hand, and each time when the duty was done, he returned home. He walked the fields of Mount Vernon not as a man hungry for glory, but as a man hungry for peace. In this, his private life was not an escape from his public one, but its fulfillment. He believed leadership was temporary, but stewardship of land, family, and personal integrity was eternal. The contrast between these two lives also shaped how others saw him. Soldiers admired his constancy because they sensed it came from somewhere deeper than ambition. Politicians respected his restraint because it mirrored the discipline he lived by at home. Visitors to Mount Vernon, after seeing his hospitality and order, carried away the impression of a man whose public virtues grew from private habits. In both worlds, he was the same, disciplined, dignified, and steady. Perhaps the most striking image comes at the end of his presidency. After serving 2 terms, Washington voluntarily stepped down, refusing to cling to power. He returned to Mount Vernon, riding home not as a king but as a farmer. The world marveled at this act of humility, but for Washington it was natural. He was returning to the life he valued most. The fields, the gardens, the house by the Potomac, these were not symbols to him but realities, the true foundation of his happiness. So when we think of Washington, we should not imagine only the man in uniform or the man in state. We should imagine him straddling both worlds, the weary general longing for his farm, the dignified president counting the days until retirement, and the private man who found his deepest joy in the steady rhythms of Mount Vernon. His greatness lay not only in what he gave to the public, but also in how he balanced that gift with a private life of discipline, order, and longing for peace. When George Washington died at Mount Vernon in December of 1799, the nation mourned him as its founding hero. But to those who knew him best, he was not only the victorious general or the dignified president. He was the man who rose before dawn to ride across his fields, the husband who sat quietly with Martha in the evenings, the neighbor who welcomed guests with measured hospitality, and the master whose household bore both warmth and contradiction. His private life at Mount Vernon left a legacy every bit as enduring as his public deeds, offering lessons about discipline, leadership, and humanity that echo long after his passing. One of the clearest legacies of Washington's private life was his belief that greatness begins with order at home. Long before he commanded an army or led a government, he practiced leadership in the management of his estate. He treated farming not as drudgery but as a science, recording experiments, testing innovations, and demanding accountability. He believed that attention to detail in daily routines built the habits of mind that allowed him to face far greater challenges later. His ledgers of crops, his careful schedules, and his relentless insistence on discipline were not just about Mount Vernon, they were rehearsals for the leadership he would exercise on a national scale. For posterity, the lesson is simple but profound. character is shaped not in moments of glory, but in the quiet discipline of everyday life. Another legacy lies in the partnership he shared with Martha. Their marriage, though not marked by dramatic passion, revealed the strength of steady companionship. Together they raised children and grandchildren, endured loss, managed crises, and balanced the burdens of public service. Washington's trust in Martha's judgment, his reliance on her presence, and her willingness to share his burdens showed that leadership is never a solitary act. Behind the public figure stood a private partnership that gave him stability. This partnership offers a lesson that resonates beyond history. Even the strongest leaders rely on unseen anchors. Washington's private life also forces us to confront the complexity of his character. He owned enslaved people, depended on their labor, and built his prosperity on their bondage. Yet in his later years, he became one of the few founding fathers to take concrete steps toward emancipation, freeing the individuals he directly owned in his will. The contradiction cannot be erased, but the evolution matters. It shows a man grappling with the moral blind spots of his time, moving however slowly toward recognition of human dignity. For posterity, this legacy is cautionary. It reminds us that even revered figures are flawed, that progress is often uneven, and that moral courage sometimes comes late. The lesson is not to excuse, but to acknowledge and learn. Greatness can coexist with failing, and our task is to see both. The social world of Mount Vernon also left its mark. Washington's hospitality, his calm presence at dinners, and his willingness to listen more than he spoke created an atmosphere of respect that shaped how others saw him. Visitors carried away the impression of a man whose dignity was rooted not in arrogance but in steadiness. This quality became central to his public image. As president, he cultivated the same balance, formal enough to command respect, approachable enough to invite trust. The lesson here is that leadership rests not only on decisions, but also on demeanor. The way one carries oneself in private shapes the confidence others place in one's public role. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Washington's private life is his yearning for peace. Again and again, he expressed his desire to retire, to live quietly at Mount Vernon, to walk his fields and sit by his hearth. He accepted public roles only when pressed by duty, and each time he longed to return home. His willingness to step down from power, first after the Revolution and later after 2 presidential terms, was rooted in his conviction that private life mattered more than public acclaim. He believed that no man should cling to power indefinitely, that the true measure of leadership was the ability to give it up. In this, his private values shaped the public precedent that would define the Republic. When visitors walk Mount Vernon today, they see the grand house, the sweeping views of the Potomac, the reconstructed gardens, and the outbuildings that kept the estate alive. But the deeper legacy lies in the stories those walls hold. Of Washington bent over his ledgers at dawn, of Martha welcoming guests with grace, of enslaved men and women laboring in fields and workshops, of children's laughter echoing in the halls, and of evenings where music and conversation softened the silence. These scenes remind us that history's greatest figures were, at their core, human beings bound by routines, relationships, and contradictions. The lesson of Washington's private life is that true greatness is not separate from the private self. His discipline as a farmer prepared him to be disciplined as a general. His partnership with Martha prepared him to rely on others in politics. His hospitality at Mount Vernon shaped the dignity of his presidency. Even his struggle with slavery, unresolved though it was, left a legacy that pushed the nation to confront the gap between its ideals and its practices. In the end, Washington's private life teaches us that leadership grows from character, and character grows from the way one lives in ordinary moments. It is not the speeches or the battles alone that define a man, but the quiet hours of discipline, the small acts of affection, the choices made when no one is watching. At Mount Vernon, George Washington lived a life that was steady, imperfect, but deeply human. And in that humanity lies the truest legacy of all, that greatness is not born in grandeur, but built in the quiet rhythm of private life. As we come to the close of our journey through George Washington's private life at Mount Vernon, we see not a statue or a face on a dollar bill, but a man complex, disciplined, affectionate, and flawed. Across these chapters, the image that emerges is richer and more human than the one offered by textbooks. Washington was a husband who relied on Martha's quiet strength, a farmer who believed in science and experimentation, a master who wrestled with the contradiction of slavery, a neighbor and host who listened more than he spoke, and a man whose deepest longing was for peace at home rather than glory abroad. His life at Mount Vernon was filled with the steady rhythms of mornings in his study, afternoons riding across his fields, evenings of hospitality, and quiet nights by the fire. In these ordinary patterns, he built the habits of self-control, observation, and patience that later sustained him in the extraordinary demands of war and politics. The man who balanced crop rotations and recorded weather patterns was the same man who balanced the hopes of an army and the divisions of a new nation. What he practiced in private became the virtues he displayed in public. And yet, Mount Vernon also tells the harder story. Its beauty and order were sustained by enslaved labor, men and women whose contributions were vital, but whose freedom was denied. Washington's eventual decision to free those he owned in his will reflects a slow moral awakening, but it also reminds us how deeply even great figures are bound by the blind spots of their time. This contradiction is part of his legacy too, and it asks us to look at history with honesty rather than idealization. Still, what endures most from Washington's private life is the lesson that leadership begins at home. His greatness did not rest only on his victories or his presidency, but on the daily habits of discipline, partnership, and humility. He proved that a leader's true measure is not how long he holds power, but how willingly he lets it go, returning to the quiet dignity of private life. In this, he gave the new republic a precedent. As powerful as any law, that service is temporary, but character is lasting. So as we leave Mount Vernon in our imagination, we might picture him one last time, tall and steady on horseback at dawn, surveying his fields with calm authority, or perhaps later in the evening, seated by the fire beside Martha, his boots set aside, his face softened in private warmth. These images remind us that behind every public figure lies a private life, and it is there, in the rhythm of ordinary days, that true character is forged. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into Washington's private world. I hope these glimpses of his home life, his contradictions, and his humanity have brought you closer to the man behind the myth. Until next time, may we remember that history is never only about battles and dates. It is also about the quiet lives, the daily choices, and the human hearts that shape the world we live in today.